The room felt hollow, each condolence falling into an abyss of grief as Timothy Morrison stood alone beside his son's casket. His weathered hands, spotted with age, gripped the podium until his knuckles whitened. Outside, October rain tapped against the funeral home windows, a soundtrack to his solitude. Timothy's eyes kept drifting toward the entrance, hoping to see his daughter-in-law's blonde hair and tear-streaked face appearing through the doorway. But the entrance remained empty, just like the chair reserved for Olivia in the front row. The funeral director approached his face, a practiced mask of professional sympathy. "Mr. Morrison, should we wait a few more minutes?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Timothy cleared his throat, swallowing the lump that had taken residence there for days. "No, let's begin." He counted the faces before him, 37 people who had come to say goodbye to Richard. 37, and not one of them was his wife of 8 years. Richard's colleagues from his consulting firm sat stiffly in dark suits, their faces showing more shock than sorrow. At 34, Richard had seemed invincible to them, brilliant, driven, successful. A heart attack wasn't supposed to take someone so young. Timothy understood their disbelief. He felt it too, alongside the crushing weight of having to bury a child, the most unnatural act a parent could perform. Timothy delivered the eulogy himself, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He spoke of Richard's childhood, how he'd caught every baseball Timothy had ever thrown to him, how he'd graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern, following in his father's footsteps, but surpassing his achievements. How proud Timothy had been when Richard started his own consulting firm 4 years ago, watching it grow from a home office operation to a respected name with major clients. What Timothy didn't mention was the growing distance between them in recent months. The canceled dinners, the brief phone calls, the strain in Richard's voice whenever Timothy asked if everything was all right. He didn't speak of the anxiety he'd noticed creeping into his son's demeanor, the dark circles under his eyes, the weight loss, the way his hands sometimes trembled when reaching for his coffee cup. And he certainly didn't mention how Richard's marriage had seemed to be fraying at the edges, though Timothy had pretended not to notice for everyone's sake. As people filed past the casket offering handshakes and awkward hugs, Timothy heard the whispers. "Where's Olivia? Isn't that his wife? How awful for her to miss this." The sympathy in their voices made his chest tighten. If only they knew how many times he'd called her, how the calls had gone straight to voicemail, how her last text had simply read, I can't face it today. I'm sorry." His grief was becoming edged with something sharper, something he wasn't ready to name. After the service, Timothy drove to the cemetery alone. The hearse followed behind, carrying his son's body through streets Timothy had known for 40 years. The same streets where he'd taught Richard to drive, where they'd celebrated promotions and birthdays, where life had seemed normal just last week. Now everything felt alien, as if the world had tilted slightly off its axis. At the graveside, Timothy stood with his shoulders back, refusing to bend under the weight of his sorrow. The minister's words blurred together, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, as Timothy stared at the polished wood of the casket being lowered into the ground. He was supposed to focus on Richard, on saying goodbye properly. Instead, his mind kept circling back to one question. Where the hell was she? Back at home, that evening, Timothy sat in his kitchen, the house too quiet around him. The sympathetic casseroles dropped off by neighbors sat untouched in his refrigerator. He'd called Olivia 6 more times since returning from the cemetery. Each call went straight to voicemail, her cheerful greeting a mockery of the day's events. He'd sent text messages ranging from concerned to angry. No response. Richard's death had been sudden, a heart attack at 34. The doctor said likely stress-related. Timothy had called Olivia immediately after the hospital pronounced him dead, and she'd seemed devastated, her voice breaking as she asked about arrangements. She promised to fly back from her sister's house in Phoenix, where she'd been visiting. That was 4 days ago, and Timothy hadn't seen her since the hospital. The silence of the house pressed in on him. Timothy had lived alone for 15 years since his wife died of cancer. But tonight, the emptiness felt different, less like solitude, and more like abandonment. He'd expected to have Olivia beside him today to share this unbearable grief with the only other person who loved Richard as much as he had. Her absence felt like a betrayal he couldn't yet comprehend. Timothy opened his laptop and did something he'd never done before. He checked social media. Richard had always been private about his personal life, and Timothy had never been one for Facebook or Instagram. But grief makes you do strange things, pushing you into unfamiliar territories in search of answers, or perhaps just connection. He found Olivia's Instagram account easily enough. Her profile picture was still her, and Richard from their anniversary dinner last year, both smiling, his arm around her shoulders, her head tilted toward him. She looked radiant in that photo. Blonde hair perfectly styled, green eyes bright with happiness, or what Timothy had thought was happiness. He scrolled down through her recent posts, his heart pounding with a foreboding he couldn't name. Photos from Phoenix dinners with her sister. Shopping trips all posted after Richard's death. All showing a woman who looked anything but grief-stricken. The captions spoke of me time and self-care. Nothing about losing a husband. Timothy's hands grew cold as he continued scrolling, a sense of unreality washing over him. Then he found it. Posted 3 hours ago while Timothy was delivering his son's eulogy was a photo that made his blood turn to ice. Olivia, in a bright red bikini, cocktail in hand, standing on a beach with crystal blue water behind her. She was laughing, her head thrown back, completely carefree. Next to her stood a man Timothy recognized, Miguel, the gardener, who'd been working on their landscaping for months. His arm was around her waist, and they were both grinning at the camera. The location tag read Cancun, Mexico. The caption made Timothy's hands shake. Life's too short not to live it. Cheers to new beginnings. And Timothy stared at that photo for 20 minutes, reading and rereading those words. While he stood over his son's grave, throwing dirt on his coffin, his daughter-in-law was toasting new beginnings in Mexico with another man. The disconnect was so profound It felt like a physical blow. The comments were even worse. Friends congratulating her on the trip, asking if she was finally happy, telling her she deserved this. One comment from her sister made Timothy's stomach turn. "So glad you're done with all that drama. Miguel is perfect for you, done with all that drama. My son's death was drama to be done with." Timothy closed the laptop with shaking hands and walked to the liquor cabinet, something he rarely did. He poured 3 fingers of whiskey, the good stuff he'd been saving for Richard's next visit, and sat back down, trying to process what he'd seen. 8 years of marriage, 8 years of family dinners, holidays, birthdays. He'd watched Olivia become part of their family, had grown to care for her like a daughter. He'd even defended her to Richard when their fights got bad, telling him that marriage required patience and understanding. What a fool he'd been. The whiskey burned his throat, but the heat didn't touch the cold spreading through his chest. Timothy had just buried his only child, and the woman who had promised to love him until death was celebrating that death as a liberation. There was no grief in that photo, no hint of the devastation that had hollowed Timothy out, only relief and joy. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Timothy ignored it, at first assuming it was another condolence message. When it buzzed again, more insistently, he reached for it with a sigh. The screen showed an unknown number, but something made him open the message anyway. What he read made the room spin around him. "Dad, come to my house now. We need to talk. Don't tell anyone. Richard." Timothy dropped the phone. It clattered on the kitchen floor, the screen cracking, but he barely noticed. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely pick it up again. He read the message 3 times, then 4, then 5. It had to be some kind of mistake. A cruel joke. Someone who'd gotten hold of Richard's phone, perhaps. But the number was different, and who would do something so sick? Timothy grabbed his car keys with trembling fingers. He had to see for himself. He had to know what kind of nightmare he'd stumbled into, because one thing was certain. He'd just buried his son this morning, and dead men don't send text messages. He drove to Richard's house in a daze, his mind refusing to accept what seemed impossible. The familiar tree-lined street looked the same as always, but everything felt different now. Wrong somehow. Timothy had been here just 2 days ago, helping Olivia pack some of Richard's things before her supposed trip to Phoenix. She'd been crying then, or at least he thought she had been. Richard's house sat dark against the October sky, a single light glowing from the kitchen window in the back. Timothy's hand shook as he used his spare key to open the front door. "Richard." His voice cracked as he called out. Silence answered him. He walked through the living room, past the couch where he'd comforted Olivia 4 days ago when the hospital called, past the family photos on the mantel, Richard's college graduation, their wedding day, Christmas mornings. Everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing made sense anymore. The kitchen light drew him forward. As he rounded the corner, Timothy froze. His son sat at his own kitchen table, very much alive, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. He looked up when Timothy entered, his face pale and drawn dark circles under his eyes that Timothy had never noticed before. He'd lost weight, a lot of weight. His clothes hung loose on his frame. Dad. His voice was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. Timothy couldn't move, couldn't speak. His brain struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. This was his son, alive and breathing, sitting in his kitchen, 3 hours after Timothy had watched his coffin lowered into the ground. You're supposed to be dead. The words came out strangled, barely human. Richard's face crumbled. I know how insane this must be for you. Please sit down. Let me explain. Timothy remained standing, his legs locked in place. I buried you today, Richard. I threw dirt on your coffin. I gave your eulogy. What kind of sick game is this? It's not a game. Richard stood up, slowly, his movements careful, deliberate. Dad, I'm in serious trouble. The kind of trouble that could destroy, not just me, but you too. Everything we've worked for. Everything our family has built. What are you talking about? Timothy's voice rose, edged with hysteria. The grief that had consumed him for days was transforming into something else. Confusion, anger, a desperate need to understand. Richard ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Timothy had seen him make thousands of times since childhood when he was nervous or scared. 6 months ago, I made a mistake at work. A huge mistake. He paused, seeming to gather his strength. I was handling the Meridian Industries account. You remember the pharmaceutical company? They were our biggest client, worth $2.5 million annually. Timothy nodded numbly. Richard had talked about that account constantly, how it was going to set his firm up for years. I discovered they were falsifying their clinical trial data, hiding serious side effects from a new arthritis medication. People were getting sick, Dad, really sick. Some were dying and... His voice broke. I should have reported it immediately. But Meridian's CEO, James Crawford, he offered me $500,000 to keep quiet. Just look the other way, he said. Let the FDA approval process continue. Timothy's stomach dropped. Please tell me you didn't take it. Richard's silence was answer enough. Timothy felt something collapse inside him. The image of his son as the principled man he'd raised. Jesus, Richard, what were you thinking? I was thinking about Olivia's spending, about the mortgage on this house, about the debt we'd racked up trying to keep up appearances. She wanted the renovations, the new car, the vacation to Europe. $500,000 would have solved everything. He looked up at Timothy, tears in his eyes. But I couldn't do it, Dad. I couldn't let people die for money. So what happened? Timothy finally moved to the table, sinking into a chair across from his son. I went to the FBI, turned over all the evidence, became a whistleblower. Crawford was arrested last month, and the medication was pulled from the market. But before they got him, he made sure I'd pay for betraying him. Richard walked into the kitchen window, staring out into the darkness. Crawford has connections, Dad, bad connections, the kind of people who don't forgive and don't forget. 3 weeks ago, I started getting threats, phone calls telling me that I'd destroyed too many careers, cost too many people too much money. They wanted me to disappear permanently. Timothy's mind raced to keep up. So you faked your death. Dr. Peterson helped me. He's an old friend from college, works at the hospital now. We staged the heart attack, falsified the death certificate. Peterson said I had maybe hours before Crawford's people found me. This was the only way. The pieces were starting to come together, but one huge question remained. What about Olivia? She was devastated when I called her. She cried on the phone. Richard's expression hardened. Olivia knew everything, Dad. About the Meridian account. About the money you turned down. About the threats. She knew I was planning to fake my death. He paused, his voice dropping to barely audible. She was supposed to play the grieving widow for 6 months, then quietly move away and meet me in Canada. We'd start over together. But she's in Cancun with Miguel. Timothy's voice was flat, the reality sinking in. Richard's laugh was bitter and broken. Yeah, I saw the Instagram post too. She was supposed to wait, Dad. We had a plan, but apparently she had a better one. Timothy thought about the photo, about Olivia's radiant smile, about the comments from her friends. She was never planning to meet you in Canada, was she? No. I figured that out when I saw my life insurance policy had been cashed in. $750,000. Paid out to my loving widow just yesterday. Richard turned back to face Timothy. His eyes haunted. She played her part perfectly, didn't she? The shocked wife. The grieving widow, too distraught to even attend the funeral. She probably figured being mysteriously absent would make her seem even more tragic. The full scope of the betrayal hit Timothy like a physical blow. She let me bury an empty pavilion. She let me grieve for you while she was planning her vacation with her lover. I'm sorry, Dad. I never meant for you to get hurt like this. I thought if I could just disappear, start over somewhere else, maybe everyone would be safer. But I couldn't let her get away with this. She not only betrayed me, she betrayed you too. Made you suffer while she counted her money. Timothy looked at his son, thinner, haunted but alive, and felt something shift inside him. The grief he'd carried for 4 days began transforming into something else entirely, something harder and colder. What do we do now? Richard met his eyes, and for the first time since Timothy had walked into his kitchen, he saw a spark of the determination that had made his son successful in business. Now we make sure she doesn't get to enjoy that money, and we make sure she pays for what she put you through. How? A slow smile spread across Richard's face, and Timothy realized his son had inherited more of his calculating nature than he'd ever known. Well, Dad, legally speaking, I'm still dead, which means Olivia is about to discover that being married to a dead man has some very serious complications. Richard moved to the kitchen counter and pulled out a laptop Timothy had never seen before. His movements were careful, methodical, like a man who'd been planning something for a long time. There's more you need to know, Dad. Things I discovered after I was supposed to be dead. He opened the laptop and turned the screen toward Timothy. Olivia wasn't just planning to abandon me in Canada. She was planning to destroy me long before that. The screen showed email exchanges, bank records, text message, screenshots. Timothy's eyes struggled to focus on the details, but Richard walked him through each piece of evidence with the precision of the business consultant he'd trained to be. 3 months ago, I started noticing money missing from our joint accounts. Small amounts at first $200. Here, $300 there. When I confronted Olivia about it, she said she was buying surprise gifts for our anniversary. He clicked to another screen. She was buying gifts, all right, just not for me. Photos of expensive jewelry designer handbags and luxury hotel receipts filled the screen, all purchased during times when Olivia claimed to be visiting her sister in Phoenix or shopping with friends in Chicago. Miguel wasn't just our gardener dad. They've been having an affair for 8 months. These hotel receipts show they were meeting twice a week, sometimes 3 times, always, on my credit card. Timothy's hands clenched into fists. She was spending your money to cheat on you. It gets worse. Richard's voice was steady, but Timothy could see the pain behind his eyes. When the FBI investigation started and I told Olivia I might have to enter witness protection, she didn't just agree to come with me. She encouraged it, said it would be an adventure, a chance to start fresh. But look at this. He opened a new folder filled with more screenshots, text messages between Olivia and someone named Marcus Financial Services. She was already talking to a private investigator, Dad, not to help protect me from Crawford's people, but to gather evidence that I was mentally unstable. Timothy leaned closer to read. The messages were cold, calculating Olivia, describing Richard's anxiety, his drinking, his erratic behavior. Since becoming a whistleblower, she was building a case that I was having a mental breakdown, that I might hurt myself or others. Timothy felt sick. She was going to have you committed. Worse than that, she was setting up a scenario where my death would look like suicide. A mentally disturbed whistleblower who couldn't handle the pressure and took his own life. She even researched how to make it look like I had been planning it for months. Richard clicked to another file, financial documents, showing Olivia had taken out additional life insurance policies on him without his knowledge. Policies worth over $1 million total, all with suicide clauses that would still pay out if he waited 2 years after the policy date. She's been planning this for 2 years, Dad, long before the Meridian situation. She married me, convinced me to take out massive life insurance, and then waited for the perfect opportunity to cash in. The room seemed to spin around Timothy. This wasn't just betrayal or even greed. This was something much more sinister. She was planning to murder you or drive me to suicide, which would be cleaner legally. The private investigator was documenting everything to support her story. Stressed businessman money problems, legal troubles, history of depression. It would have been an open and shut case. Timothy stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful, normal. Inside this kitchen, he was learning that his daughter-in-law was essentially a predator who'd spent years planning to kill his son for money. But then you faked your death first. Dr. Peterson's plan gave me an unexpected advantage. Olivia thought she'd won. She got her insurance money without having to commit actual murder. She could play the tragic widow, collect her payoff, and start her new life with Miguel without any blood on her hands. Richard pulled up another screen showing bank activity. She wasted no time. Insurance money deposited on Monday. $50,000 transferred to Miguel's account on Tuesday. Plane tickets to Cancun purchased Wednesday morning. She was out of the country before my body was even cold. Except your body was never cold because you were never dead. Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting. Richard's expression shifted, becoming more calculating. Olivia doesn't know that I'm alive, but she also doesn't know that I found all this evidence before I died. He opened a new folder labeled Insurance Fraud Evidence. The contents made Timothy's breath catch. Richard had documented everything. The forged applications, the unauthorized policies, the payments to the private investigator, the affair with Miguel, even communications showing Olivia had researched methods of murder that would look like accidents. She committed multiple felonies, Dad. Insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit murder theft, adultery, with financial implications for the divorce proceedings she was planning to avoid by becoming a widow. Richard closed the laptop. The question is, what do we do with all this information? Timothy sat back down, his mind racing. We could go to the police, have her arrested for fraud. We could, but there's a problem with that approach. Richard leaned against the counter. If I reveal that I'm alive, I have to explain why I faked my death. Dr. Peterson could lose his license, maybe go to prison for falsifying records. The FBI witness protection people will be furious that I went off script, and Crawford's people will know exactly where to find me. So we're stuck. Not stuck. We just need to be smarter about this. Richard sat back down across from Timothy. Olivia thinks she's won. She's got her money, her lover, and her freedom. She's probably planning to stay in Mexico for a few months, let the grief period pass, then come back and sell the house, liquidate everything else, and disappear forever. What's stopping her? Well, technically, she can't sell the house or access most of our shared assets while I'm legally dead. The estate has to go through probate, which takes months, but she's got the life insurance money, so she figures she can wait. Richard smiled grimly. What she doesn't know is that I documented her fraud before I died, and dead men can still file insurance claims disputes. Timothy stared at his son, seeing a side of him he'd never witnessed before. The anxious, overwhelmed man he'd worried about for months had been replaced by someone harder, more strategic. What are you planning, Richard? I'm planning to let Olivia enjoy her vacation for exactly 2 more weeks. Let her get comfortable, spend some money, make some plans. And then I'm going to systematically destroy every lie she's built. He opened the laptop again. I've already filed disputes with all 3 insurance companies claiming fraud. The investigations will freeze her accounts within days of being initiated. Can you do that while you're dead? I set up the disputes before I died with instructions to my lawyer to waive them if certain conditions were met. As far as the insurance companies know, Richard Morrison suspected his wife was planning to kill him and took precautions. He pulled up legal documents. I also changed my will the day before I died, leaving everything to you and cutting Olivia out completely, due to suspected infidelity and financial impropriety. The scope of Richard's planning was staggering. You've thought of everything. Not everything. I didn't think she'd be stupid enough to post photos of herself partying in Mexico 3 days after my funeral. That was a gift I couldn't have planned for. Yeah. Richard's smile was cold. Those photos, combined with the financial records showing money transfers to Miguel, will make the insurance fraud case airtight. What about Miguel? He's complicit in this. Miguel's the least of our problems. He's just a guy who thought he was dating a rich widow. When Olivia's money disappears and the fraud charges hit, he'll disappear too. Men like Miguel Don't stick around for poor women with legal problems. Timothy looked at his son with a mixture of pride and concern. This is a dangerous game, Richard. What if Olivia figures out you're alive? Then we accelerate the timeline. But I don't think she will. She's too busy celebrating her victory to question it. He closed the laptop again. Besides Dad, she's already made her biggest mistake, which is she underestimated both of us. She thought you were just a sad old man who'd grieve quietly and never ask questions. She thought I was too weak and anxious to ever fight back. Richard's eyes hardened. She was wrong on both counts. Timothy felt something settle in his chest, a calm determination he hadn't experienced in years. What do you need me to do? For now, just keep being the grieving father. Don't change anything about your routine. But in 2 weeks, when the insurance companies freeze her accounts, and she comes running back demanding answers, I need you to be ready. Richard met his eyes. Because that's when we spring the trap, and that's when Olivia learns that some games have consequences she never saw coming. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of Timothy's life. He had to continue playing the role of the grieving father while knowing his son was alive and hiding just 20 minutes away in a small apartment he'd rented under a false name. Every day felt like walking on a tightrope, maintaining the facade, while helping Richard orchestrate what he called Olivia's reckoning. Timothy visited Richard's grave twice a week, just as a bereaved father would. He brought flowers, stood there for appropriate amounts of time, and even talked to the headstone when other visitors were nearby. It felt obscene, performing grief over an empty coffin, but it was necessary. Several neighbors and family friends approached him during these visits, offering condolences and asking about Olivia's well-being. Such a tragedy, Mrs. Henderson from down the street said during one visit. Poor Olivia, losing Richard so young. Is she holding up all right? I haven't seen her around. She's taking some time away, Timothy replied, the lie sliding out easier than he expected. Staying with family. The grief has been overwhelming for her. What Timothy didn't tell Mrs. Henderson was that he'd been monitoring Olivia's social media obsessively. The Cancun photos continued beachside dinners, sunset, cocktails, spa treatments, shopping sprees. Miguel featured in most of them, sometimes with his arm around her, sometimes kissing her cheek. The comments from her friends had evolved from sympathy for her loss to celebration of her healing journey. Her sister posted, "So proud of you for choosing happiness. Richard would want you to live your best life." That comment made Timothy want to throw his phone across the room. Richard had been busy during those 2 weeks. From his temporary apartment, he had been feeding information to insurance investigators, providing them with time-stamped evidence of Olivia's affair, her suspicious financial activities, and most damning, her social media posts showing her celebrating in Mexico, days after her husband's funeral. The investigators are calling it one of the most clear-cut cases of insurance fraud they've ever seen. Richard told Timothy during one of their secret meetings at a diner outside town. He looked healthier now, having gained back some weight and lost the haunted expression he'd worn that first night. 3 insurance companies, $1.7 million in fraudulent claims, and she's literally posting evidence of her crimes online. When do they act? Today, actually. The accounts should be frozen by this afternoon. Richard stirred his coffee slowly. I estimate she's already spent close to $80,000 in Cancun. When she can't pay for her hotel room, reality is going to hit pretty hard. What if she just stays in Mexico, disappears? She can't. Miguel doesn't have that kind of money, and without access to the insurance funds, she's essentially broke. Her credit cards are tied to accounts that are about to be frozen. She'll have to come back and face the consequences. Richard was right. On Thursday afternoon, Timothy's phone started buzzing with calls from a number he recognized Olivia's cell phone. He let them all go to voicemail. By evening, he had 12 increasingly frantic messages. The first few were confused. Timothy, something's wrong with my bank accounts. Can you call me, please? By the seventh message, panic had crept in. Timothy, I'm stuck in Mexico. The hotel is saying my cards aren't working. I need you to wire me some money until I can figure this out. The final messages were desperate. Please, Timothy, I know you're getting these. I'm scared. Something's happening and I don't understand. They're saying I can't leave the country until I settle my bills. Please help me. Timothy played each message for Richard the next morning. He listened with an expression Timothy couldn't quite read, not satisfaction exactly, but a grim sense of justice being served. She's really panicking, Timothy observed. Good. She should be. Richard closed his laptop, where he'd been monitoring news feeds about insurance fraud investigations. The FBI contacted me yesterday. Well contacted my lawyer, claiming to represent my estate. They want to interview the surviving family members about possible financial irregularities involving the deceased's wife. They want to interview me, you and Olivia, when she's back in the country, which according to the Mexican authorities should be very soon. They're not going to hold her indefinitely, but they are requiring her to settle her debts before leaving. How is she going to do that without access to her accounts? Richard's smile was cold. That's where Miguel comes in. Turns out he's been bragging to his friends about his rich American girlfriend, posted photos of the expensive gifts she's been buying him, the luxury hotels they've been staying at. When the money dried up yesterday, so did his enthusiasm for their relationship. He left her, took the first flight back to Chicago this morning. Olivia is alone in a foreign country with no money, no friends, and a growing list of legal problems. Richard leaned back in his chair. I almost feel sorry for her. Almost. Timothy didn't feel sorry for her at all. Every time he remembered standing over that empty grave, throwing dirt onto a coffin that contained nothing but weighted pillows, his sympathy evaporated. When does she get back? Her flight lands tomorrow evening. She managed to contact her sister, who wired her enough money for a plane ticket. But she's coming back to a very different world than the one she left. Are you ready for this? Richard nodded slowly. I've been ready since I saw those Instagram posts of her laughing on the beach while you buried an empty coffin. His voice hardened. She humiliated you, Dad. She made you grieve alone while she celebrated with her lover using money she stole from our family. That's not something I can forgive. And you're sure this will work? The insurance fraud case is airtight. She'll either take a plea deal or go to trial. But either way, she's looking at serious prison time. The money she stole will have to be returned plus penalties and interest. Her reputation is destroyed. and she'll be lucky if she doesn't end up owing more than she's worth after legal fees. Richard paused, looking out the diner window at the ordinary suburban street outside. But the legal consequences are just the beginning, Dad. The real justice comes when she realizes that everyone knows what she did. Her friends, her family, our neighbors. They're all going to learn that she's not a tragic widow who lost her husband too young. She's a con artist who tried to cash in on that husband's death while betraying him with another man. She'll try to contact me when she gets back. Let her. But remember, as far as you know, I'm still dead. You're just a grieving father who's slowly learning that his daughter-in-law isn't who he thought she was. Richard reached across the table and squeezed Timothy's hand. I'm sorry you have to keep pretending to grieve for me, Dad. I know how hard this has been on you. Timothy squeezed back. Having you alive and safe is worth any amount of pretending. This will all be over soon. Once Olivia is arrested and charged, once the truth comes out publicly, I can start the process of legally returning from the dead. It'll be complicated, but Dr. Peterson has connections who can help smooth things over with the authorities. And then what? You can't go back to your old life. No, I can't. Richard Morrison will have to stay dead, at least officially. But Timothy Morrison's son can start fresh somewhere new, with a new identity and a chance to build something better. Richard's expression softened. Maybe even with his father, if that father wants to leave this place behind and start over too. Timothy thought about his empty house, his quiet retirement, the loneliness that had been his constant companion since his wife's death. The idea of starting fresh, of having his son back in his life, was more appealing than he cared to admit. We'll see, he said. First, let's make sure Olivia gets exactly what she deserves. Richard smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it was a real smile, not the calculating expression he'd worn while planning his revenge. Oh, she will, Dad. She definitely will. Tomorrow night, when she walks into that house, expecting to resume her life as a grieving widow, she's going to discover that some lies have consequences she never imagined. Timothy's phone rang at 9:45 that Friday evening. Olivia's number flashed on the screen. He let it ring 4 times before answering, just long enough to sound like a man who'd been lost in grief. Timothy, thank God you answered. I'm so sorry. I haven't been able to call. There were problems with the phone service in Mexico. And then my flight was delayed, and everything has been just awful. Timothy kept his voice carefully neutral. I was wondering when you'd get back. I'm at the house now, but something's wrong with the locks. My key isn't working and there's some kind of notice on the door. I can't read it properly in the dark. Her voice cracked, slightly into performance worthy of an award. Could you come over? I know it's late, but I'm scared to be alone right now. Timothy glanced at the clock. Right on schedule. The locksmith Richard had hired had changed the locks that afternoon, and the notice on the door was from the PE informing Olivia that the house was part of an ongoing fraud investigation. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Thank you, Timothy. I don't know what I'd do without you. You're the only family I have left, now that Richard is. She broke off, making a sound that might have been a sob, but sounded more like exhaustion. The drive to Richard's house felt surreal. Timothy had made this trip hundreds of times over the years. Family dinners, holidays, helping with home repairs, babysitting their dog when they traveled. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he was driving toward a confrontation that had been building for weeks. Olivia was standing on the front porch when he arrived, looking nothing like the radiant woman from the Cancun photos. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her skin pale and drawn. She wore wrinkled clothes that looked like she'd slept in them, and her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion or tears. Timothy couldn't tell which. "Timothy, thank you for coming." She rushed toward him, attempting to embrace him, but he stepped back slightly. The movement was subtle, but she noticed. Her expression flickered with confusion. "Let me see this notice." Timothy walked past her to the front door. The FBI document was official and intimidating, full of legal language about asset freezing and ongoing investigations. Timothy read it slowly, watching Olivia from the corner of his eye. She was pacing behind him, wrapping her arms around herself. "I don't understand any of this. Why would the FBI be involved with Richard's death? It was a heart attack. Natural causes." Timothy turned to face her fully for the first time. In the porch light, she looked even worse than he'd initially thought. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hands were shaking slightly. "Olivia, where exactly have you been for the past 2 weeks? I told you I was in Phoenix with my sister, dealing with the grief, trying to process everything." The lie came out smoothly practiced. "And then I took a few days in Mexico. The doctor said travel might help with the depression." "Mexico." Timothy repeated the word flatly, watching her face. "Just for a few days. Sarah thought a change of scenery might help me cope with losing Richard." Her voice grew stronger, more confident, as she settled into her story. "I know it might seem insensitive, but I was falling upon Timothy. I needed to get away from all the memories here." Timothy nodded slowly, as if accepting her explanation. "I can understand that grief affects people differently." Relief washed over her face. "Exactly. Thank you for understanding. I knew you would." She gestured toward the house. "But I still don't understand why the FBI would be involved, or why my locks don't work. Maybe we should call someone, get some answers." Timothy pulled out his phone. "I have the number for Richard's lawyer. He might know what's going on." "Yes, please, call him. This has to be some kind of mistake." Timothy dialed the number Richard had given him. His lawyer, David Chen, had been briefed on their plan and was expecting the call. He answered on the second ring. "David, this is Timothy Morrison. I'm here at Richard's house with Olivia, and there's an FBI notice on the door about some kind of investigation." Timothy paused, letting the lawyer speak on the other end of the line. "Uh-huh, I see. When did this happen?" Olivia moved closer, trying to hear the other side of the conversation. Timothy turned slightly away from her. "Insurance fraud?" "What do you mean, insurance fraud?" The color drained from Olivia's face. She grabbed his arm. "What's he saying?" Timothy held up a finger, continuing to listen to David's explanation. "Multiple policies, unauthorized applications." He looked directly at Olivia. "David, Olivia is right here. She says she doesn't know anything about this." Timothy. "What is he talking about?" Olivia's voice was rising, panic creeping in. He says the FBI has evidence that someone forged Richard's signature on several life insurance applications. Large policies that Richard supposedly took out without telling anyone. Olivia's face tightened. That's impossible. Richard died of a heart attack. The doctors confirmed it. Timothy continued talking to David. Financial irregularities. What kind of irregularities? Another pause. Account transfers to unauthorized recipients. Suspicious spending patterns. Olivia's hands were shaking visibly now. Timothy, tell him this is all a mistake. I don't know anything about insurance policies or financial irregularities. David wants to know if you can account for your whereabouts over the past 2 weeks. The FBI apparently has questions about some large cash transactions that happened right after Richard's death. I was grieving. I was with my sister. Her voice lacked conviction. Now the carefully constructed story beginning to crumble. Now he says they also have questions about social media posts. Photos posted from, where did he say, Cancun. Timothy let the word hang in the air between them. Olivia's face went completely white. She took a step backward away from him. How do they know about Cancun? The admission slipped out before she could stop it. Timothy ended the fake call with David and put his phone away. So you were in Cancun, not Phoenix, with your sister. I can explain that. After Phoenix, I needed more time to heal. Sarah suggested Mexico might be therapeutic, but she was floundering now, her story falling apart. Therapeutic. Timothy repeated the word the same way he'd said Mexico earlier, letting it hang between them. Was Miguel therapeutic too? Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. How do you know about Miguel? The FBI showed me photos, Olivia. Photos of you in Cancun with another man. Photos posted on social media while I was standing over my son's grave throwing dirt on his coffin. Timothy's voice was getting harder, colder. Photos of you celebrating with your lover using money from Richard's life insurance. Tears started flowing down her cheeks, but they looked more like panic than genuine remorse. Timothy, you don't understand. I loved Richard, but our marriage was complicated. He was distant, anxious all the time. Miguel was just a friend who helped me through a difficult period. A friend you were sleeping with for 8 months while married to my son. How do you... She stopped, realizing she was only making things worse. Look, I made mistakes, but Richard's dead and nothing can change that. Can't we just move forward as family? Timothy stared at this woman he'd welcomed into their family 8 years ago. This woman he'd defended to Richard when their fights got bad. This woman who'd stood in his kitchen 4 days after his son's death, crying in his arms about how much she missed him. You're right about one thing, Olivia. Nothing can change the past. Nothing can change the fact that you let me bury my son alone while you were partying with your boyfriend in Mexico. Timothy turned toward his car. The FBI will be in touch. I suggest you get a good lawyer. Timothy, wait, please. You have to help me. I don't have anywhere else to turn. Timothy stopped and looked back at her one last time. You should have thought about that before you decided to cash in on Richard's death. He drove away, leaving her standing alone on the porch of the house she could no longer enter. In his rearview mirror, he saw her collapse onto the front steps, her head in her hands. But he felt nothing, not satisfaction, not pity, just a cold certainty that justice was finally being served. 20 minutes later, Timothy pulled into the parking lot of Richard's temporary apartment. His son was waiting by the window, and Timothy could see the tension in his shoulders, even from a distance. This was the moment they'd been building toward for 2 weeks. "How did she look?" Richard asked, as Timothy climbed the stairs to his second-floor unit. Terrified, exhausted, caught. Timothy sat down heavily in the small living room. "She tried to lie at first, but when I mentioned the FBI photos and Miguel, she fell apart. Good. She needs to understand that her actions have consequences." Richard was pacing now, nervous energy radiating from him. "Tomorrow morning, she'll wake up to find FBI agents at whatever motel she's staying in. They'll arrest her on insurance fraud charges, and that's when the real consequences begin. Are you ready for what comes next?" Richard stopped pacing and looked at Timothy directly. "Dad, I've been dead for 2 weeks. Tomorrow I get to come back to life and watch the woman who betrayed us both face justice for what she's done." His expression was grim but determined. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." Outside, snow began to fall, covering the parking lot in a thin layer of white. Tomorrow would bring the final act of their carefully orchestrated plan, and Olivia would learn that some betrayals carry a price she never imagined she'd have to pay. The FBI arrested Olivia at 6:30 on Saturday morning at the Budget Inn where she'd spent the night. Timothy wasn't there to witness it, but Richard had a contact in the bureau who called him with updates. She'd tried to run when they knocked on her door, the contact said, but there was nowhere to go in a motel room with one exit. Richard and Timothy met at the same diner where they'd been planning this moment for 2 weeks. Richard looked different this morning, lighter, somehow as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "She's been charged with insurance fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and money laundering." He told Timothy over coffee that had grown cold while they waited for news. Bail was set at $500,000. Can she make bail? With what money? Her accounts are frozen. Her credit cards are maxed out from the Cancun trip. And Miguel disappeared the moment her funds dried up. Her sister might try to help, but Sarah doesn't have that kind of cash lying around. What about Miguel? Do we know who he really is? Timothy asked, remembering the man who had been in almost every photo with Olivia in Cancun. Richard's expression turned grim. The FBI has been watching him for a while. His real name is Diego Ramirez. He's not just some gardener having an affair. He's a professional con man who targets wealthy women. Apparently, Olivia is the third wife he's convinced to take out fraudulent insurance policies on their husbands. The revelation stunned Timothy. So she was being played too. Yes and no. The FBI believes she initiated the affair, but Diego certainly encouraged her worst instincts once he realized her potential. He probably suggested the additional insurance policies and helped her research ways to make my death look natural. Richard shook his head. She thought she was the predator, but she was just prey for a bigger predator. Timothy thought about Olivia sitting in a jail cell, probably still wearing the wrinkled clothes she traveled in. 2 weeks ago, He might have felt sorry for her. Now he felt nothing but a cold satisfaction that justice was finally being served. "When do you come back from the dead?" Richard smiled the first genuine smile Timothy had seen from him since this whole nightmare began. "This afternoon. Dr. Peterson has everything arranged with the hospital administration and the police. The official story is that there was a mix-up with patient identification, that Richard Morrison was in a coma rather than dead, and that he's made a miraculous recovery. Will anyone believe that? It doesn't matter if they believe it. What matters is that it's legally documented and medically supported. Dr. Peterson has colleagues who will swear to the confusion, and the hospital's lawyers have already agreed to treat it as a medical error rather than fraud." Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping, even though they were alone in their corner booth. "The beauty of it is that once I'm officially alive again, all of Olivia's insurance claims become void automatically. She'll owe back every penny she collected plus interest and penalties. What about Crawford and his people? Are they still a threat?" Richard shook his head. "Crawford died in prison last week, heart attack, and his organization fell apart once the FBI arrested the key players. I should be safe now, especially with a new identity and a fresh start." "New identity?" Richard smiled. "Well, I can't very well go back to being the Richard Morrison who supposedly died and then came back to life. But Timothy Morrison's son, Robert, could start a new consulting business in a different state. Maybe somewhere warmer than Chicago." The idea appealed to Timothy more than he wanted to admit. "Robert Morrison. I like the sound of that. What about you, Dad? Are you ready for a new chapter too?" Timothy thought about his empty house, his quiet retirement, the loneliness that had been his constant companion. Then he thought about the past 2 weeks working alongside his son to bring justice to someone who'd wronged their family. It had given him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "Robert Morrison is going to need a business partner," Timothy said. "Someone with experience and wisdom to help guide a new consulting firm." Richard's smile was radiant. "I was hoping you'd say that. We're not just rebuilding a business, Dad. We're rebuilding our lives, and this time we're doing it together." At 2:00 that afternoon, Timothy drove to the hospital to witness his son's resurrection. Dr. Peterson met him in the lobby, looking nervous but determined. He was risking his career to help Richard, but he'd explained that he couldn't stand by and watch a good man be destroyed by a predatory wife. "Are you ready for this, Timothy?" he asked as they walked toward the elevator. "I've been ready for weeks." Richard's hospital room was on the 4th floor, the same floor where he'd supposedly died 2 weeks earlier. When Timothy walked in, Richard was sitting up in bed, dressed in a hospital gown, looking appropriately weak and confused for someone who'd just emerged from a coma. "Dad." His voice was uncertain, his eyes blinking against the fluorescent light. "What happened?" "I remember chest pains, and then nothing. The performance was flawless." Even knowing it was an act, Timothy felt a surge of relief at hearing his son's voice again. "You've been in a coma, son. We thought we'd lost you." Dr. Peterson entered with a clipboard and a concerned expression. "Mr. Morrison, I need to explain what happened. There was a significant medical error involving patient identification. Your son was never actually deceased. He was in a catatonic state that mimicked death, but our monitoring equipment malfunctioned, and several staff members made critical errors in diagnosis. But we had a funeral, Timothy said, playing his part. I know, and I cannot apologize enough for the trauma this has caused your family. The hospital will cover all costs associated with the error, and we're conducting a full investigation into how this happened. Richard squeezed Timothy's hand weakly. Dad, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine what you've been through. What matters is that you're alive. Timothy looked at Dr. Peterson. When can he go home? A few more days of observation just to make sure there are no lingering effects from the coma. Dr. Peterson made notes on his clipboard. I'll also need to contact your son's wife. She should know about his recovery immediately. About that, Timothy said carefully. Olivia was arrested this morning. Insurance fraud. Richard's eyes widened in genuine surprise, or a perfect imitation of it. Arrested? What are you talking about? While you were in your coma, she filed multiple life insurance claims. Apparently, she'd taken out several policies without your knowledge and was trying to collect on them. Timothy watched Richard's face carefully. The FBI says she was working with someone else, a man named Miguel. Miguel. Our gardener. Richard's confusion looked absolutely authentic. Dad, I don't understand any of this. Dr. Peterson cleared his throat. Perhaps we should let Mr. Morrison rest. This is obviously a lot to process after a traumatic medical event. No, I need to understand what's happening. Richard tried to sit up straighter. Olivia tried to collect life insurance money while I was in a coma. She thought you were dead, son. We all did because of the hospital's error. But apparently, she'd been planning this for a long time. Ishmael pulled out his phone and showed Richard screenshots of Olivia's social media posts from Cancun. While I was planning your funeral, she was in Mexico with Miguel, celebrating what she thought was her newfound freedom. Richard stared at the photos, his face cycling through shock, hurt, and anger in a masterful display. She was cheating on me with our gardener. She was cheating on you for 8 months, according to the FBI, and she was trying to steal money by pretending you were dead. She wasn't pretending, Richard. As far as she knew, you really were dead. She just didn't seem very broken up about it. Timothy put the phone away. The FBI has evidence that she was planning this long before your medical emergency. She may have even been hoping something would happen to you. Richard leaned back against his pillows, looking devastated. 8 years of marriage, Dad. 8 years. And she was planning to cash in on my death. The only thing more painful than betrayal is realizing it was never real to begin with. I'm sorry, son. I know this isn't what you want to hear while you're recovering. No, I need to know the truth. Richard's voice grew stronger, more resolved. What happens to her now? Prison, most likely. The fraud charges alone could get her 10 years, and if they prove she was conspiring with Miguel to target other men, it could be much longer. Dr. Peterson checked his watch. I should let you both have some privacy. Mr. Morrison, I'll be back to check on you this evening. After the doctor left, Richard and Timothy sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. The performance was over, at least for now. Richard was officially alive again, and Olivia was facing the consequences of her betrayal. How do you feel? Timothy asked quietly. Free, Richard said simply. For the first time in months, maybe years, I feel completely free. He looked out the hospital window at the city beyond. I know I can't go back to my old life exactly as it was. Too many people know about the medical error, and there will always be questions. But I can start over. Sometimes you have to die to truly begin living. The media picked up on the story of Richard's miraculous recovery with predictable enthusiasm. Dead man, waking Chicago. Consultant returns to life after funeral mix-up, screamed one headline. Grave error. Hospital apologizes for premature death declaration, proclaimed another. Reporters camped outside the hospital, hoping for interviews or photographs. Dr. Peterson fielded their questions with professional caution, citing medical privacy laws, while providing just enough information to make the mistake seem plausible. The hospital's PR team worked overtime issuing statements about procedural reviews and system improvements. Behind the scenes, their legal department negotiated a substantial settlement with Richard enough to fund his fresh start in a new city with a new identity. News of Olivia's arrest emerged just hours after Richard's resurrection became public. The timing couldn't have been better if they'd planned it. The juxtaposition was irresistible to journalists. The husband returns to life as the wife is charged with attempting to profit from his death. The story dominated local news for days, with "Widow Who Wasn't" splashed across front pages, and Cancun's celebration while family mourned, featured prominently in evening broadcasts. Timothy watched the coverage with a strange detachment, as if observing events happening to someone else. In a way, they were. This public spectacle was happening to people called Richard and Olivia Morrison, names that would soon belong to the past. The future belonged to Robert and Timothy Morrison, men who would leave this scandal behind and build something new from its ashes. 3 months later, Robert Morrison Consulting opened its doors in Charlotte, North Carolina. The business cards listed Robert Morrison as CEO and Timothy Morrison as senior partner. They specialized in helping companies navigate ethical challenges and fraud prevention expertise they'd gained through hard experience. Their office occupied the 10th floor of a glass and steel building downtown, with views of the city skyline that still took Timothy's breath away each morning. "We should have done this years ago," Timothy said one morning, as he watched his son, now legally, Robert, review their latest contract proposal. The transformation in him was remarkable. Gone was the anxious, haunted man who'd hidden in a small apartment, fearing for his life. In his place stood a confident executive who carried himself with purpose and clarity. The resurrection of Richard Morrison had faded from public memory almost as quickly as it had captured attention. The story of a medical mix-up, a falsely declared death, and a miraculous recovery had been interesting for about a week before being replaced by fresher scandals. The hospital had settled quickly, and Dr. Peterson had faced only minor administrative consequences after his colleagues corroborated his version of events. What hadn't faded as quickly was the story of Olivia Morrison. Her trial had been brief but devastating, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence forged insurance applications, bank records, showing transfers to Miguel, now identified as Diego Ramirez, hotel receipts, and most damning, her own social media posts documenting her celebration while her husband's funeral was taking place. Olivia's attorney had advised her to accept a plea deal, but she had initially refused, believing she could charm her way out of consequences. That decision proved catastrophic when FBI investigators revealed Diego's true identity, not a simple gardener, but a con man with outstanding warrants in 3 states whose specialty was seducing wealthy women and encouraging them to defraud their husband's life insurance. Diego had been captured in Guatemala and extradited to face charges. His testimony against Olivia in exchange for a reduced sentence revealed the depth of her involvement. According to Diego, she had been the one to initiate their affair, approaching him after seeing him working in a neighbor's yard. She had suggested increasing Richard's life insurance and had researched methods to induce a heart attack that would appear natural. When confronted with this testimony and the mountain of evidence against her, Olivia finally accepted a plea deal, 12 years in federal prison, for insurance fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. The insurance companies recovered most of the money she had stolen, though she'd managed to spend nearly $100,000 during her brief taste of freedom. Timothy had attended her sentencing hearing, watching from the back of the courtroom as she stood before the judge in an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, her face devoid of makeup. She looked nothing like the polished woman who had sat at his dinner table for 8 years, nothing like the carefree beauty laughing on a Mexican beach. When given a chance to address the court, she spoke in a voice so quiet the judge had to ask her twice to speak up. "I made a terrible mistake. I was lonely in my marriage, desperate for connection. Diego made me feel alive again, and I lost myself in that feeling. I never intended to hurt anyone." The judge had been unmoved. Ms. Morrison, the evidence clearly shows months of premeditation, multiple acts of fraud, and a complete lack of remorse until you were caught. Your posts celebrating your husband's death while his father grieved alone show a callousness that this court finds particularly disturbing. You betrayed not just your marriage vows, but the most basic tenets of human decency. As the bailiff led her away, Olivia's eyes had met Timothy's across the courtroom. For a moment he thought he saw genuine regret there. But then she was gone, disappearing through a side door to begin serving her sentence. The only communication Timothy had received from her since was a single letter arriving at his Chicago address a month after her sentencing. "Timothy, I know you'll probably throw this away, and I wouldn't blame you. What I did was unforgivable. I've had a lot of time to think in here, and I want you to know that my grief at Richard's funeral wasn't entirely an act. Despite everything, there was a part of me that did love him, or at least the idea of him. I grew up with nothing: a mother who died by suicide when I was 12, a father who disappeared when I was 15. When I met Richard, he represented everything I'd never had: stability, success, family. But I never knew how to value those things properly, always looking for the next escape, the next thrill. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you. You were kind to me, welcomed me into your family, and I repaid that with deception. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope someday you can find peace." Olivia Timothy had folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer without showing it to Robert. Some wounds were too fresh to reopen, some bridges too thoroughly burned to rebuild. Perhaps in time, they would both find a way to process the betrayal without letting it define them. For now, it was enough to focus on building something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The transition to their new identities hadn't been without challenges. While the legal paperwork had been straightforward, thanks to connections in the FBI Witness Protection Program, the emotional and psychological adjustments proved more complex. Robert struggled at times with the erasure of his former self, 34 years of identity, suddenly replaced by a fabricated background and credential set. The first month in Charlotte had been particularly difficult. Timothy watched his son flinch at the name Robert and catch himself midway through signing documents with his old signature. There were nightmares, panic attacks when he spotted men in suits who resembled Crawford's associates, and moments of profound disorientation when he couldn't immediately recall details from his new backstory during business meetings. Timothy had found him one night, sitting in their shared apartment's living room at 3 a.m, staring at old photos of himself and Olivia on his laptop. "Do you think any of it was real, Dad? Any moment in those 8 years when she actually loved me? Or was it all just a long con?" Timothy hadn't had an answer that would ease his son's pain. He'd simply sat beside him until sunrise, a silent witness to grief that couldn't be shared with anyone outside their bubble of truth. Gradually, however, Robert had emerged as more than just a cover identity. He developed his own mannerisms, preferences, and professional style similar to Richard's in many ways, but distinct in others. Robert was more direct, less concerned with pleasing everyone. He took risks Richard might have avoided, and spoke with an authority that came from surviving the unthinkable. Their consulting business flourished, built on their unusual expertise in identifying corporate fraud and ethical breakdowns. Without revealing the personal story behind their insights, they used their hard-won knowledge to help companies strengthen their internal controls and create cultures of integrity. Within 3 months, they had 6 major clients and a growing reputation for spotting red flags others missed. Timothy found himself thriving in this new chapter. After 15 years of widowhood and a retirement that had felt more like waiting to die than living, he now woke each morning with purpose. Working alongside his son, using his decades of business experience to mentor not just Robert, but their small team of analysts, he felt useful again, necessary. The move to Charlotte had given him not just a fresh start, but a second chance at the most important relationship in his life. As their business grew, so did the scrutiny they faced. Background checks became increasingly thorough, and the thin paper trail they'd created for Robert occasionally raised questions they struggled to answer smoothly. At a business dinner with a potential client, the CFO of a healthcare company looking for help with compliance issues, an uncomfortable moment arose when the man mentioned attending Northwestern around the same time Robert supposedly had. Strange, we never crossed paths. I was pretty involved in the business school. What dorm were you in? Robert handled it smoothly, mentioning a building on the far side of campus, and quickly steering the conversation back to the client's needs. But the exchange left him shaken, and that night he confessed to Timothy that he worried their fresh start might not be as solid as they'd hoped. "How long can we keep this up, Dad? Every time I meet someone from Chicago, I'm terrified they'll recognize me. Every time someone digs into my background, I'm waiting for them to find the holes." Timothy understood the fear. He'd seen it growing in recent weeks, the way Robert scanned every restaurant they entered, how he'd flinch when someone called Richard in public, the increasing frequency of those 3 a.m. insomnia sessions. The freedom they'd fought so hard for was being eroded by the constant vigilance required to maintain their fabricated reality. The solution came from an unexpected quarter. A potential client, the CEO of a tech startup focused on secure communications, approached them after hearing about their expertise in corporate ethics. The woman, Elaine Chen, was direct and perceptive in a way that immediately put Timothy on edge. "Your insights into corporate fraud prevention are impressive, but there's something missing in your backstory. I've done my research on you both, and the trail gets awfully thin before about a year ago. I don't care what you're running from, but if we're going to work together, I need to know I can trust you." Instead of the carefully rehearsed deflections they'd developed, Robert made a decision that changed everything. He told her a version of the truth, that he had been a whistleblower against a pharmaceutical company falsifying trial data, that he had entered an informal witness protection program after threats to his life, that he and his father had rebuilt their lives under new identities. He omitted the details about faking his death and Olivia's betrayal, presenting the story as a straightforward case of corporate retaliation and necessary protection. To their surprise, Elaine was not only sympathetic, but impressed by their integrity in the face of personal risk. "That's exactly the kind of ethical backbone I want advising my company. I respect that you stood up against corruption, even at great personal cost. Your experience gives you insights others simply don't have." She became not just a client, but an advocate, recommending their services to her extensive network with a simple message: these men understand integrity because they've paid the price for it. Gradually, their consulting focus shifted toward working with companies led by people like Elaine, entrepreneurs and executives who valued their unusual journey rather than being suspicious of it. This pivot allowed them to be more authentic, to draw more directly on their experiences without revealing the most private aspects of their story. It also expanded their reach beyond Charlotte, taking them to tech hubs in Austin, Seattle, and Boston, where Robert's former identity was less likely to be recognized. 6 months into their new business approach, they landed their biggest client, yet a multinational tech firm requiring a comprehensive ethics audit following a data privacy scandal. The contract would set them up financially for years and establish their reputation at the highest levels of corporate America. The night they signed the agreement, Timothy and Robert celebrated at an upscale restaurant overlooking Charlotte's skyline. As they raised glasses to their success, Timothy noticed something he hadn't seen in his son for a very long time: genuine, unguarded happiness. Not the calculated satisfaction of revenge fulfilled, not the nervous relief of a crisis averted, but simple joy in the moment and hope for the future. We did it, Dad. We actually built something real from all that chaos. When I was hiding in that apartment, terrified Crawford's people would find me, I never imagined we'd end up here. Life rarely follows the path we expect. Timothy replied, thinking of his own journey from Chicago, widower, to Charlotte business leader. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes if we're brave enough to keep moving forward. D. On the first anniversary of Richard's death, they visited a small cemetery on the outskirts of Charlotte. They didn't know anyone buried there, but it seemed important to mark the day somehow. They brought flowers, not out of morbid humor, but as a reminder of how close they'd come to losing each other forever. As they stood before a stranger's headstone, Robert asked the question that had been on both their minds. Would you do it all again? Knowing everything that would happen. Olivia's betrayal, the funeral starting over in Charlotte. Would you make the same choices? Timothy didn't need to consider his answer. Without hesitation, we lost some things along the way. Your name, our home, certain illusions about people we trusted. But look what we gained, truth, purpose, each other. He placed his hand on his son's shoulder. Some people live entire lives without experiencing the kind of clarity we found through all this chaos. That's worth any price we paid. Later that week, an unexpected email arrived from James Crawford's former assistant, informing them that Crawford had died. His cancer had progressed faster than expected, taking him just 4 months after his release from prison. The assistant mentioned that in his final days, Crawford had become fixated on Richard Morrison's mysterious recovery, convinced there was more to the story than a hospital error. He'd even hired private investigators to look into it. The news sent a momentary chill through both men, but it passed quickly. With Crawford gone, the last person who might have had both the motivation and resources to expose them was no longer a threat. It felt like the closing of a chapter, the final resolution of the crisis that had begun with Richard's whistleblowing a 1.5 years earlier. That evening, as they sat on the balcony of their shared office, overlooking the Charlotte skyline, Robert reflected on the journey they'd taken. You know what I've been thinking lately, Dad? All those years ago when you taught me to play baseball, you always said the same thing when I struck out. It's not about never failing. It's about getting back up to bat. He smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in a way that had once seemed impossible. I think we've finally done that. We got back up to bat. Timothy knotted his throat tight with emotion he didn't need to express. Ahead of them, Charlotte glowed with possibility, the life they had built from nothing, now solid beneath their feet. Olivia had sought to profit from death, but instead, she had inadvertently given them the greatest gift of all, the chance to truly live. Their success continued to grow over the next year. Robert Morrison Consulting expanded to 15 employees with offices in Charlotte and Austin. They developed proprietary fraud detection software based on the patterns they'd observed in corporate whistleblower cases, creating a revenue stream that complemented their consulting services. Industry publications began to take notice, with Forbes featuring them in an article about innovative approaches to business ethics. Timothy took on a mentorship role with their younger employees, sharing his decades of experience, while finding renewed purpose in guiding the next generation. Robert led the firm's strategic direction, his confidence growing as his new identity became more firmly established. The shadows of the past receded further with each passing month, though they never disappeared entirely. Occasionally, news about Olivia would reach them. She had become a model prisoner leading support groups for women with histories of trauma and deception. Her story had been featured in a true crime documentary series, though she had declined to be interviewed. Diego Ramirez was serving 20 years for his multiple fraud schemes with no chance of parole for at least a decade. On the second anniversary of their move to Charlotte, as they stood on the balcony of their expanded offices, watching the sun set over the city, Timothy reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed. The grief and betrayal that had nearly destroyed them had instead become the foundation for something stronger and more authentic than what came before. "I never thought I'd say this," Timothy said, "but in some strange way we owe Olivia a debt of gratitude. If she hadn't betrayed you, we wouldn't be here now." Robert considered this for a moment. "I think that's how healing works, Dad. You take the worst thing that happened to you and transform it into something else entirely, something that serves you instead of destroying you." As they turned to go back inside, Timothy felt a profound sense of peace. The story of Richard Morrison had ended in an empty coffin and a grieving father. But the story of Robert and Timothy Morrison was just beginning, written not in deception and betrayal, but in resilience, purpose, and the unbreakable bond between father and son.